Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to this webinar on Brexit, getting to grips with overseas recruitment. My name is Katie Jacobs from CIPD, and I'm hosting this afternoon's webinar. Could we say it's a welcome break from COVID? I'm not sure it's an equally challenging topic, but we're going to be helping you get to grips with the changes to recruiting from overseas that you need to be aware of. So if you've been so busy coping with the impact of the pandemic and feel that you might have dropped the ball on Brexit a bit, for a start, I think that's pretty understandable and common. And secondly, we hope this is the session for you to help you out. So joining me this afternoon to share their insights and take your questions, I have a really great panel of experts. I'm joined by Gerwyn Davies. Gerwyn is our Senior Labour Market Advisor at the CIPD, and he therefore has default become our expert on all things Brexit and workforce planning. Ian Robinson is a partner at Fragomen, which is a provider of immigration guidance and support. And Beverly Dixon is Group HR Director at the fresh produce supplier G's. So she has plenty of experience in recruiting overseas seasonal workers at volume to share. Thank you all for joining us today. As ever, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping quickly. The webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to access it later via the CIPD's Brexit Hub. You can also download the slides from later today, so you will be able to get hold of those and all the information on them. Please do get your questions in, and we'll take as many as we can after the presentations. Please use the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your screen. Use that to submit your questions. We won't really see your questions if you put them in the chat, so please do use the Q&A instead. Visit the CIPD's Brexit Hub, which is regularly updated with resources and guidance there to support you. We have a new guide for employers on your legal obligations around post-Brexit immigration, which might be useful, and my colleagues will paste links to various things in the chat for you as well. If you're a CIPD member, I just want to remind you that you can access legal advice via our HR Inform Employment Law helpline. So if you have any queries that we don't get to hear, you could use that helpline to get an individual response. And also just to flag that we are not able really to answer very, very complex individual queries on this webinar. We'll be trying to kind of group questions together rather than take incredibly long ones that are specific on certain cases. So if you do need that individual advice, I would advise you to get some immigration employment law support. And finally, just to flag as usual that our wellbeing helpline is there to support you if you need it, so please do use it, and we've got information about that at the end of the session. So on with the topic. On the 1st of January, the UK's participation in free movement with the EU came to an end, and in its place the Home Office has implemented a new points-based immigration system, which is designed to facilitate the entry of skilled workers while making it quite a lot harder for employers to recruit from abroad for low-skilled or low-paid vacancies. Now, as I alluded to earlier, for the past year, many people professionals have been a bit preoccupied coping with the pandemic. So what are the changes and legal implications that employers need to be aware of? While the EU settlement scheme has enabled organisations to retain a lot of existing EU talent, what is the picture for overseas recruitment going forwards? And how can employers get on top of their strategic workforce planning post-Brexit? That's what our panel are going to be talking about this afternoon, as well as taking your questions. We're going to hear from Gerwyn first, who's going to set the scene a little bit and talk a bit more about workforce planning. And then Ian's going to give a legal viewpoint, and then over to Beverly to kind of bring it to life a little bit more in practice. And then we'll take your questions, but please do get them in throughout the presentations. That's it from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Gerwyn to kick us off. Thanks, Gerwyn.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd start with a dramatic shift that's already taken place even before Brexit in terms of the stock of overseas workers. And this is no surprise. What we've seen is a sharp reduction in the number of overseas workers in employment in the UK since the onset of the pandemic. And as you'll see from the graph, that fall is particularly acute among EU nationals. And this is perhaps no surprise given the restrictions and the travel restrictions that's led to this sharp reduction in inflows. But also we've seen a very weak recruitment activity. In addition, we know that if you look at the composition of those that have been furloughed, a high concentration of them tend to be in accommodation and food services and other low-skilled sectors. They are in elementary and manual occupations, and London has the highest furlough take-up rate. And what's common to all those categories is that they all have a high concentration of EU nationals. So it's very plausible that many EU nationals have returned home, and of course many will have pre-settled or settled status, which gives them that guarantee, albeit in a case of pre-settled status, a relatively short-term one, to come back to live and work in the UK. So it remains to be seen how many might come back. Now, I should add a note of caution here that this is based on official ONS data. They're very careful to say that they've had difficulties capturing good data for obvious reasons. But I have to say that given the anecdotal feedback that we've heard from employers, the consistency this graph has with other indicators and business surveys, I think there's something very real taking place. Now, this of course comes at a time when recruitment activity is weak, so it won't unduly concern employers in the short term, but this will undoubtedly have a major impact when the economy recovers. Next slide, please, Christian. And of course, these factors, certainly in terms of the first half of this year, are not going to go away. We don't expect to see recruitment activity bounce back. Restrictions are obviously still very much still very relevant. We have a third factor that's just been introduced, which is the introduction of new migration restrictions, which means at the end of free movement of labour for EU citizens. Now, I should stress that this obviously excludes the Republic of Ireland, so they will be able to travel to the UK and live and work as they have been doing. But all the other countries that form part of the EU will be subject to these migration restrictions. And then I think there are two key restrictions that will play out, especially for low-skilled sectors, and that's the introduction, at least for EU nationals, of a minimum salary threshold, which is 25,600. But there are some exemptions attached to that, and I'm sure Ian will expand on this later. The exemptions are for public service occupations, for instance, or shortage occupations. So that shouldn't be taken as read. There's some flexibility around that. But also the introduction of a skill level, RQF level 3, for Scotland is level 6, which effectively bars employers from recruiting for low-skilled positions. So we're talking about care workers, bar staff, hospital porters, these kinds of roles where employers will simply have to recruit from the domestic workforce because there is no low-skilled or temporary route available to the UK. One of the things that we have been hoping for as part of the Brexit agreement was that, and it was mooted by the UK government a couple of years ago, that we would see perhaps a reciprocal youth mobility scheme introduced that would allow people to come into the UK for a limited period. It's 2 years. It will affect people aged 18 to 30, but it's gone very quiet. So we'll certainly not going to hold our breath for any developments in the short term. And as has been indicated, this will affect low-skilled employers, especially those in the likes of agriculture and accommodation and food services. And this reflected by the fact that the majority of the workforce in hospitality is employed in roles below RQF level 3. And this will affect London even more, again reflected by the stat that I think around a third of the workforce in hospitality in London are EU nationals. This will have a major impact. Next slide, please, Christian. Looking ahead, when the economy recovers, and who knows when that is, I think we can expect to see some uptick, certainly from the second half of this year as the vaccination programme very much kicks in. But the expectation is that we might see actually non-EU immigration levels increase because the restrictions I referred to earlier actually looser than what they've experienced compared with recent years. So if you've got the RQF level 3 restriction, for instance, that has come down from 6, which is graduate level occupation. So you can see employers take advantage of this because it opens up a new range of occupations that they can recruit for. And in addition, and have to give credit to the Home Office here, the system undoubtedly is being made easier through digitalization, but also they've made it a lot quicker and easier, notably through the removal of the resident labour market test, which forces employers to advertise for certain roles for a certain period. Now, that has disappeared. But that is going to be more than offset by the fall in the inflow of EU migrants. This is due to the restrictions I referred to, but also the wide range of costs and the bureaucracy involved, which just doesn't include visas. You're talking about sponsorship license, your immigration skills charge, among a couple of other charges that I could mention. And that's not to say that the costs end there. We have the compliance issues to deal with, on an ongoing basis. I think what this all points to is the re-emergence of labour and skill shortages. What we've seen is that those labour and skill shortages have receded this year, despite the fall in the stock of migrants, and then simply because employers are not hiring. And I think that the vacancies are around a third lower than where they were last year. Next slide, please, Christian. I think what this points to is that if ever there was a time to update or introduce a workforce planning strategy, it's certainly now. And I think we should give ourselves some slack here. Workforce planning is not an exact science. It's subject to so many variables, the high levels of uncertainty in terms of the business environment, political environment, COVID. But I think, so what this is trying to do is just to make people think about certain aspects of your business strategy and overall operations that can help prepare you for when the economy recovers and deal with this supply shock that's already taken place and will play out over the next couple of years. And so just to highlight a couple of things, so if you look at location, for instance, I think what that highlights is there's an interplay between the impact of the pandemic and Brexit. So some employers, as we know, are expecting to see a huge increase in home working in the future, even when things return to near normal. And what that could mean is it opens up a huge range of possibilities in terms of where you can locate your staff and address that historical problem that we've had in terms of the mismatch between geography and skills in the UK, and open up roles that perhaps with the preserve of London and the Southeast, that could be a possibility for some. For those who have supply chains across the UK and the EU, that might force you to rethink where your location might be and what that might mean for the workforce that you have. In terms of the size and cost, my comments are mainly reserved for low-skilled sectors, but we know that some of these sectors have tended to innovate less than others, and some commentators have cited perhaps the huge increase in EU nationals over the past decade as a potential reason for that. And of course, that's not to say that's necessarily true, because we don't have firm evidence on that, but it's certainly the case that we will see innovation increase because of these migration restrictions. But also we know that from various studies that a lot of tasks have the potential to be automated, and business surveys suggest that they will be. So now is the time to perhaps look at whether automation is the right vehicle for you, especially in sectors such as accommodation and food services. And of course, then you've got that management employee ratio to deal with that might result from that. And then lastly, in terms of the cost of recruiting individuals, you have, to put it crudely, a choice between perhaps incurring the cost of recruiting overseas workers, and that includes the range of costs and bureaucracy I mentioned earlier. But I think it's also worth reflecting on the additional costs, especially in terms of compliance, and what additional resource you might need in terms of the HR function to deal with things like right to work checks. And of course, this is new for so many employers. The vast majority don't have experience of the immigration system, will feel very daunted by it, and will feel the need to perhaps get expertise from outside the organization, certainly in the short term, if not the long term. Next slide, please, Christian. And these are contextual factors that could shape the thinking around what the stages are of a workforce planning strategy. And it's useful, I think, to start with that baseline, knowing your workforce, but in this specific Brexit context, to know what proportion are EU nationals, as well as their salaries and roles, especially given the introduction of a minimum salary and skill threshold, so you know exactly what the threat is further down the line, if and when those people leave, and what the opportunities are or not of replacing them. I think it's worth adding, and I know Ian's going to cover this more extensively, that it'd be useful to log where you're at with the EU settlement scheme as well, and pre-settled and settled status. In terms of the supply, I think organisations are best assessing themselves in terms of the local communities that they serve, what the potential supply is. But it's often overlooked that the Migration Advisory Committee compile a very useful shortage occupation list, which highlights areas where they feel that there simply aren't enough people to fill the vacancies, and it is sensible for employers to fill those shortages with overseas workers. And this has become much more relevant in line with the lowering of the skill threshold, because whereas before it was very much graduate level occupations and above, because the range has increased, it now includes things like bricklayers, among other lower skilled roles. So it opens up more opportunities, and it's a really useful source of intelligence. In terms of the demand side, it's important to recognise what your future workforce needs are clearly, but especially for the critical roles. And again, conversations perhaps with the line managers might be a useful starting point to assess what those specific needs are. But despite even the severe impact the pandemic has had on the economy, we're still seeing labour and skill shortages persist, especially in areas such as IT, engineering, social care, and indeed agriculture. So recruiting overseas workers is inevitable in both the short term and medium term. And of course, this will mean, again, that you will need to firstly get to grips with the immigration system fast if you haven't already. And secondly, decide how you're going to resource it, whether that be recruit from within or get expertise from externally, rather. Next slide, please, Christian. Which leads me on to the buying and building and the various levers that organisations have looking ahead to the prospect of addressing some of these potential labour and skill shortages. I just thought I'd highlight just a couple of things that result from some of these levers. Firstly, there's as we've already documented, there's a specific issue around low-skilled employment and the historic challenge that employers have faced in trying to recruit people from the domestic workforce into a low-skilled work. And this comes at a time when we know that youth unemployment is rising rapidly. And so, for instance, male youth unemployment, those aged between 18 to 24, account for 40% of the increase in unemployment levels since the onset of the pandemic. So there's almost compensating and offsetting this fall in the stock of migrants. So there's a challenge as to how organisations can get better at trying to attract young people, in particular from the domestic workforce. And we know from studies that pay is a big issue. So the reservation wage is the wage at which a job seeker will accept the job, and historically, it's, we appreciate this. It's not been easy, and it's certainly not going to become any easier given the huge cost constraints are under many employers, that is. But that shouldn't be just one part of the solution. One should look at the relationship you have with your local colleges and schools. There is the apprenticeship program. We know that social media plays extremely well, and perhaps the evidence is mixed in terms of how well targeted some of the social media campaigns are from employers. So the whole suite, I think, of tactics that employers can use to try and overcome this challenge. And one thing to highlight in terms of improving retention, which, as we know, is one of the key problems, and one of the reasons why we have recruitment problems. While we've seen employers show huge levels of enthusiasm for home working, and that's undoubtedly going to increase labour market participation, both in the short term and long term, that's not been matched with similar levels of enthusiasm for flexible working. Yes, we've seen flexi time and, to a lesser extent, annualized hours increase over the recent past, but there are a whole range of others which could open up the jobs market to older workers and those with caring responsibilities in particular. So things like term time working and job sharing and 9-day fortnights, we've not seen, they've been suddenly low, which is very surprising given the tight labour market. So there's a big opportunity there. And lastly, on skills investment and apprenticeships, again, notwithstanding the cost constraints that employers are under, this disruption to labour supply, both in the short and medium term, in theory, should increase the incentives for employers to either maintain, given the expectations, or better still, increase skills investment in the UK. And again, we have apprenticeships which are falling perversely, given the backdrop, which could be reversed and needs to be, especially given what we've talked about. But also the challenges on line managers. We know that they are under massive pressure, and if home working is going to increase, these challenges to coordination are not going to go away. And that's an area that needs significant investment, which again will help with not just attraction but also retention.
Thank you so much, Gerwyn. I'm going to hand over to Ian now to take us through some of the legal aspects. I can see Ian's been industriously answering lots of questions in the Q&A, so thank you, Ian. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I'd answer questions, because otherwise I was looking at Bev's background thinking I need a banner, because all I've got now is no curtains and a cracking in the ceiling. Sorry about that. So I'm a partner with Fragomen, the immigration law firm. What I'm going to talk you through is the arrangements in place for Europeans who were here before the turn of the year, and then the arrangements that are now in place for all migration other than Irish migration to the UK in the new points-based system. Quick reminder that the arrangements for Irish nationals have not changed. Our relationship with Ireland goes back far further than our relationship with the European Union. So Irish nationals continue to benefit from, to all intents and purposes, free movement. If we could move to the next slide, please, Christian. So firstly, we need to think about people who are in the UK before the turn of the year, before 2021. For these people, they will be able to make an application under the terms of the UK and EU withdrawal agreement. What that means is that they will be applying, if they're in the UK, under what's called the EU settlement scheme. A few points on this. Many of you will already be familiar, so I won't go into too much detail, but there are several considerations here. The first is it is available to Europeans who are in the UK, arrived in the UK before 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020. Likewise, it will be available to any non-European family members of those Europeans. Irish nationals don't need to apply, but if you're Irish and you have a US partner, your partner wouldn't need to apply, and it will generally make sense for the Irish national to put an application in. The application itself is really straightforward. It's not like other immigration applications. very few people will need legal advice or to ask for help with the application. You download an app onto your smartphone, you run it over your passport, it uploads your biographical details, you answer several questions online on your browser. It checks your records against tax and other government records. And if the Home Office know that you've been in the UK for 5 years, they will tell you that you're entitled to settled status, which means you can stay permanently. If they think you've been here for less than 5 years, and that's right, then you will be granted pre-settled status. If you've been here for 5 years, but the Home Office's access to tax and other records is incomplete, you can provide evidence to show that, yes, I was here, but I was studying and, not claiming benefits, not paying tax, etc. Decisions come back in a couple of weeks, and only serious criminals are being refused. It's really important that people take care to make sure that they get what they're entitled to. Settled status is a great form of status because it means you can just stay. And finally, and I'll cover this towards the end, the most important thing is that the deadline is the 30th of June 2021, and this matters because on the 1st of July 2021 people who have not applied will, to all intents and purposes, be treated as being in the UK illegally. And it's hard not to seem like I'm over dramatizing here, but essentially the hostile environment controls that applied to that turned lives upside down for the Windrush generation, which doesn't quite do the justice to how difficult it was for people, will apply to Europeans who haven't applied on time. The Home Office will accept some applications late, but we don't know when or in what circumstances. So do encourage your friends, family and employees to apply. If you haven't already, communicate with them, explain how they can make an application and explain the risk to them. It makes sense to do it probably over the next month or two, and again as you're getting closer to the end of June, so maybe the end of May would make sense. If you take a look on the CIPD website, there's briefing on this in the guide that we produced with CIPD a few weeks ago. If we were to move on to the next slide, so that was for people who were here before the end of the Brexit transition period. For people who enter the UK from now going forward, since the beginning of the year, there is a single immigration system for everyone. If you are used to employing Europeans, what you're going to find is that the new system is slower and more expensive than free movement. You're going to find, as Gerwyn has said, that it's harder, often impossible, to recruit low-skilled workers. And it may be that you can mitigate the impact if people had visited the UK before the end of the year, but it's slightly complicated there. If you are used to recruiting non-European workers, then conversely, the system will never be as good as free movement for employers, but actually it's quicker and, for the user, more straightforward than the previous system. It's no less complex than the system that was in place for non-Europeans, but it's definitely quicker and smoother. If you're going to sponsor people, if you're going to employ people under this system, then to get out of the gates, you will need a sponsor license. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll explain what that means. So a sponsor license, I've seen from the questions, some good questions on there, by the way. A sponsor license it's best understood as a contract between an employer and the Home Office. And the contract says that we, the Home Office, will allow you to sponsor workers and bring them to the UK as long as you're compliant. And you in return are signing up to certain compliance duties, such as managing right to work, tracking and monitoring where your sponsored workers live and work, reporting if a person appears to have absconded. I've never known that to happen with skilled worker, but I understand why the Home Office, in fact, it was my policy when I first met Gerwyn and I worked for the Home Office. And I understood then why it was needed. The process for becoming a sponsor takes roughly, right now, 2 to 3 months. You're looking at a week to a month to collect the documents that essentially demonstrate that you are an active trading company in the UK and that you have sufficient controls in HR to be able to meet your sponsored duties. It then is taking the Home Office somewhere between 1 and 2 months to consider applications. There is a priority service available, but it's quite hard to get the priority service because it's quite limited numbers at the moment. at some point, lots and lots of employees are going to realise that headcount freezes will end, COVID will hopefully clear. They'll realise that they need a sponsor licence and a queue could form. The Home Office is content that they will be able to manage with that, manage that queue. But if you think that you're going to need to sponsor people in 2021 and you don't already have a licence, I'd recommend applying sooner rather than later, just so that you don't find yourself at the end of end of quite a long queue in the future. If we move on to the next slide. So once you have your sponsor license, you can begin to sponsor. And there are two main categories we're going to talk about. The first one is skilled worker, which is what used to be called Tier 2 General for those of you who are already a sponsor. The second, which I'll come to, is an intra-company transferee visa. So a skilled worker visa is available to people who can meet the tests that you can see on the screen. Firstly, they need to be approved by that, employed by that approved sponsor and issued a certificate of sponsorship. They are allocated to your sponsor license. Issuing a COS doesn't take too long, but getting all of the information together to make sure a person is compliant can do. They need to be in a skilled job, and as Gerwyn has said, that's RQF free, so A-level or diploma level and above. They need to be able to speak English language at a reasonable level. If the job, and then they need to meet the minimum salary requirements. So this is quite complicated on the screen. It's more complicated in real life, but it is navigable. So firstly, for most people, the minimum salary for the job is going to be £20,600 or above. But if a person is in a shortage occupation, it can be as low as £20,480. Likewise, if they have a PhD in a STEM subject, or if they are a new entrant. And new entrants, broadly speaking, are people aged under 26 or reasonably fresh out of university. That's the minimum salary for the actual visa. But for every job in the labour market, there is also a minimum salary attached. The minimum salary is based on the going rates paid to workers in each particular job category, taken from national level data. Typically, if you're looking at level jobs, you're probably looking at in the order of £25,000 to £28,000 anyway. Graduate jobs tend still to be over £30,000. You need to be looking at both of those points when you're going through this. For those of you who were familiar with Tier 2 General, you'll know that there used to be a resident labour market test which said that you have to advertise for 28 days on your website and Job Centre Plus. That is gone now, so you don't need to worry about the resident labour market test. Likewise, there used to be a cap of about 1,700 visas available every month. The cap has been suspended. What that means is that whereas in the past, if you were sponsoring in this category, I'd have said assume a 3 to 4 month lead-in time. Once this gets going, we're expecting it to be probably about a month lead-in time, possibly quicker if you pay for priority services. The other consideration, and Gerwyn talked about this too, is it's really expensive. If we were sponsoring Beverly for 3 years as a single woman coming to the UK, that would cost us as a large employer £5,700 in government fees. If it were Gerwyn and let's say he had 3 children, his wife, and was coming for 5 years, that would be £27,000 in government fees, if I've got that right in my head, certainly over 20,000. A massive amount of money, so do budget plan for that. If we move on to the next slide, there is also the intra-company transfer category. This is for multinationals to send employees of their home overseas entities to the UK. The really quick summary of this route is that they typically need 12 months company experience and to be paid at least £41,500, although that can be lower for graduate trainees. It's much as we've been used to, but the two changes that are quite important are, firstly, whereas in the past, if you were sponsored in this category for over 3 months, you could not come back for a year from the point that your visa expired. There will now be a cooling off period rule that says you can spend no more than 5 years in any 6-year period in the UK, unless you're a high earner in the category, to give more flexibility. The other helpful change is that in the past, so the ICT category is limited typically to 5 years stay, and then a person has to go home. The Home Office are now saying that you can move into the skilled worker category from ICT, and after 5 years, apply for indefinite leave to remain. So if you have ICTs working for you, it may make sense to have a conversation with their line manager to say, do you want them to stay permanently? And if you do, and they would like to stay permanently, move them into the skilled worker category. If we move on to the next slide. So to finish off just on right to work, we've had quite a few questions on this. So I'll cover it now, and it may be that the questions are helpful as we come to it. Bears speaking to twice. Essentially, for the first 6 months of this year, if you are recruiting a non-European or a UK national, no change to their right to be in the UK or their rights, and no change to the process for right to work. If you're recruiting a European national for the first 6 months of this year, then they personally will need to have the right to work in the UK. That might be pre-settled status, it could be settled status, it could be the skilled worker visa. It may be that they have a spouse visa or another visa that allows them to work in the UK. Spouse visas, by the way, do allow low skilled work. They need that, but you as an employer only need to see that they're European and take a copy of their passport in the usual way for a right to work check. So your statutory excuse will be provided by having a certified copy of the passport in the usual way. But in the background, the individual may not hold any status and may not know that they need to hold status. So there are a couple of considerations here. From a compliance perspective, check that they're European for the first 6 months of this year. You've done your job, you're compliant. But from a welfare perspective, you may want to consider whether or not you signal to people that if they do not have the right to work, they will need the right to work, because if not, further down the line, the hostile environment will kick in. Now, there are several ways that clients are doing this. Some are asking people to tell them. There are employment law considerations there. Do speak to an employment lawyer who understands your risk profile, because guidance doesn't allow you to ask that question, but it may be worthwhile given the risk to the individuals. Other clients are providing a piece of paper or talking to an employee and saying, do you have status? Because if not, these are the risks to you. And if you were here before the end of the year, pre-settled status or settled status is available, but you must apply before the deadline at the end of June. So I've covered quite a lot of ground there, moved quite quickly. If we move to the next slide, I will stop there. I'm sorry, I went over a little bit, but I can deal with the rest in questions. Over to you, Bev.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm sure if you're able to answer any of the questions quickly, like I think that would be fantastic, and we'll find a way to share the content that's being answered as well. But Bev, over to you to set some kind of context-specific examples.
Well, Gerwyn and Ian, thank you for laying that out so clearly. And what I'll try to do is relate it to some of the things that we're doing and have been doing over the last few months. So we'll go quickly through the slides, if that's okay, Christian. Next slide. So G's is a grower, distributor, and supplier of salads and vegetables. And we supply all the UK supermarkets, lots in Europe and some worldwide. And some of the numbers on here, that involves 1 billion packs of produce per annum. Now, some of that, next slide, Christian, some of that is grown in the UK, in Spain, in Czech, Senegal, Poland, and we've also got business in the USA, although we don't farm there. So you can imagine there's a lot of transport of goods across Europe. So next slide. So this is what our business looks like, and the reason for showing this slide is to illustrate the types of roles that are available and the skill level of people that we employ. So at any one time across the business, we're employing 8,000 people. Half of those people will be seasonal, whether in the summer it's around 3,500 in the UK, in the winter in Spain there's another 3,500, and then the rest is made up of Czech and Poland and Senegal. So we have roles right the way through the supply chain. So some of those are highly skilled technical functions, and others are what would be deemed as unskilled workers doing seasonal work. So next slide. Brexit, next one. This is when it obviously hit us. So, we were so concerned about deal or no deal, because of course there could well have been tariffs applied to each one of those products. But of course there was a deal. So next slide. And this is how it's affected us. So at the moment, right now, we are in a grace period, but we've got particular issues around transport. So the new procedures mean that the product at quite a detailed level that's been put onto a lorry has to be declared to the Spanish authorities before that truck leaves Spain. So 24 hours is quite a long time when you're harvesting short life products. And I don't know if you've been watching the weather forecast, but at the moment in Spain it's snowing. So they don't always put the right product doesn't always arrive in line with what they've declared, and therefore the whole thing has to start again. So the reason I mention that from a people perspective is we're having to really invest in helping people go through an organisational change, culture change, get used to new practices, and really understand the importance of being specifically detailed, which we have never had to do before. We've made the most of every bit of space on that lorry for efficiency reasons. And then the other thing that's more relevant for us here today is we worked with government, so both DEFRA and talking to the Home Office on the need to extend the seasonal worker pilot scheme beyond Brexit, beyond the 1st of January. And brilliantly, we were allocated 30,000 visas across the industry. Now, that's less than the NFU were asking for. They asked for 45,000 visas, because as an industry, we employ 70,000 seasonal workers in the UK each summer. So we'll keep moving on, thank you. Yeah, they're just all the people that we collaborated with. Next 2 slides, next one. Go for another, Christian. So let's look at what this looked like last summer, because of course we learned a lot of lessons last summer because we had to deal with the difficulties around the pandemic, which actually will still be impacting on us, of course, in the forthcoming season, as well as making sure that we've got people with the right status to be able to recruit. But just to give you an indication of the profile of this workforce, so out of the 3,600 people that worked with us last summer, 600 of those people came in on the seasonal worker pilot scheme that we originally had, which at that point was restricted to outside of the EU. We then had 2,500 people from the EU, who the majority of which are returners year after year, but they found it really difficult to get back into the UK because of the pandemic, as borders were closing around them. And we recruited 500 people for the first time in about 30 years from the UK, which was fantastic. And some of the feedback that we got from the UK people was just invaluable in improving the work and the life for the people, for all colleagues. So it's worked really well for us. And it's going to be important, as you can imagine, as Gerwyn illustrated on the very first slide, this labour market is tightening. So we need to be that great place to work that we're all aspiring to do. So next slide, Christian. So let's have a look at this. So obviously colleague health was our biggest priority. But having specialist tailored targeting recruitment campaigns was also a key learning, and being able to attract the people in the right way and make it appropriate for whichever country that we are recruiting in, making sure that we recruit in the language that people truly understand, and then having a clear role expectation. Because whenever we're people are in short supply, we actually want them to stay with us for the whole of the season. We don't want to have to keep replacing people as the season goes along. So being absolutely clear about what the job is like, which did take a lot of time in whichever country we're recruiting in, took more time than usual to explain, to make sure that we got the right people in the right jobs. And if I just apply that to the British people, which you might be interested in because of all the press and what have you, they did only stay with us on average 30-something days, 34 days out of a season of 6 to 9 months. However, because we'd spent the time with them at that recruitment stage, when they did accept a job, they turned up, which is great. And I know there were lots of other people who had the experience of the British people not turning up, but that wasn't the case if we really invested the time explaining how it was. So, okay, where are we now? So as we've heard, particularly from Ian, the only people that we can bring into the UK that are deemed unskilled, that were guaranteed, are those with some level of settled status, whether it be pre-settled or settled. We now have, as an industry, these 30,000 visas, but as I've said, that's not quite sufficient. So we need to absolutely reduce labour turnover throughout the season and offer a different package to people so that we're attracting people, and we are that great employer that wants to come and work with us. And our competitors are not down the road, they're sitting in Germany. We're in competition with Germany and other countries like that are great agricultural producers. And we will be recruiting people from the UK. So we need to work out what that means and do it well. So I ended up with 3 Ps, not really intentionally, it just turned out that way. But the preparation is everything Gerwyn was talking about, the workforce planning, and really looking into what is that business impact assessment of this shortage of labour. I use the word labour there. I don't like that word. They're people. We need to treat people as individuals. We need to kind of shift the language, in my view. So some of the business impact assessment for Gs in a grower like us is to, if it's a crop where we find it really difficult to mechanise because the crop is tender and it's quite difficult to pick with a machine, then it may well be that we have to grow that crop outside of the UK so that where people are available to work. Just coming to the, have we invested in mechanisation and innovation? We have invested a lot. It's around £20 million a year, but unless you know the size of the business, that's difficult to put in context. But what I can say is we've increased our productivity of the harvest team by 20% over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And if we hadn't have done that, we'd have been looking for 20% more people to harvest the same crops. We're helping people get settled status. Absolutely everybody that we know that has worked with us over the last few years, we've contacted and explained the situation to them and helped them if they need help to get that status. We did have a few issues, particularly COVID related, where people were reluctant to send their passports off to the Home Office. Because there's some people that don't have biometric data for various reasons, particularly in Romania, and they just didn't want to be parted from their travel documents, and you can understand that. And also it was at one point taking a heck of a lot longer than 2 weeks, but that's moved on now. Continuing to work with government is really important. Because I can't remember whether it was Ian or Gerwyn mentioned the MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee, having their shortage occupational list. It would be really helpful to get some additional roles onto that list. That's the first ask of government. And the second ask for me is to extend the number of labour providers that are included in the seasonal worker pilot visas to include direct recruiters, because ideally, you can tell from the way I'm speaking, we really like to get to know the people that are coming to work with us. And to do that through an agent just puts another step in the process. It also, but this isn't the primary reason, it also introduces additional costs. And we've talked about that a little bit in other areas too. So really valuing and working to attract everybody in all the pipelines that we've got is something that we're focusing on. So whether it be we've upgraded their pre-induction training, we've upgraded the communication and the social media to keep in contact with people, even when they're home, whether that be abroad or in the UK, keep talking to people to stay engaged so that we are encouraging as many people to return as possible. We will have people in the UK with settled status that may well be, as Ian and Gerwyn said, may well have been made redundant from some of the some other industries that have been harder hit by COVID, and we can recruit those people. We'll have British people that are less interested in seasonal roles, admittedly, but some people are, and some people will be prepared to do, you know, if we ring fence some roles that are perhaps in the pack houses, that may well be more attractive to that pipeline of people. And then, of course, getting as many people from the EU that already have settled status. And as Ian explained, we know we can bring people across for the next 6 months, but we are providing that information about the need for settled status ultimately if they would like to stay in the UK, and we're helping people do it where we can and where they need it. And in terms of productivity, that's just all about really helping people to be the best they can be in whichever job that we're doing. And that is all about the things that we know and love, about having great leadership skills. And again, we've upgraded our leadership program, and we have actually introduced additional management teams to support the people management, as well as that real hard edge productivity when it comes into harvesting at scale and at pace. But I think perhaps I'll leave it there, Katie, and I hope I've managed to bring it to life a little bit.
Thank you so much, Bev. It's really great to hear from somebody who's actually having to do it. We've only got a few minutes left. I might run over slightly. Loads of questions. Ian's been like typing away, so that's absolutely fantastic. We'll find a way to get this content to you in written format so you can access that. So I'm just going to theme the questions really. We had quite a lot about rejecting people, or saying you actively do not want to sponsor people, putting on job adverts, you need to have settled status. Ian, where do people stand on that?
It's risky territory. There have been cases in the past that have found against employers for screening out candidates or potential employees because they were not interested in sponsoring. Before you do that, you will need to make sure that you have a strong rationale, and then an employment lawyer has taken a look. And I say a strong rationale, even then, we are in new territory. So how strong that will be, or even if it's possible, is unclear just yet. It probably can only be tested at an employment tribunal.
Bev, is there any way that you're kind of rethinking your recruitment and the words you use?
Just simply that explanation actually of the immigration situation, and then putting support in place, whether it be technology, you know, helping people with an iPad thing, or help, you know, physically helping them do it.
Brilliant. We had a few questions as well, including one in advance on volunteers. If you're not paying somebody, but they are working for you without being paid, but as volunteers, what do you need to do?
So it is possible to sponsor in these short-term arrangements for volunteers, but first it's worth taking a look at the visit rules for volunteers, which allow unpaid volunteering for up to 30 days in certain circumstances. It gets, I took a look at it as I was looking at the question, it gets quite complicated quite quickly, but visit will tend to be the best option for short-term volunteering.
Brilliant. People asking about, do they need to see that employees have applied for their settled status permission? What is the onus on the employer to have gathered the evidence, and what is the onus on the employee?
So you've got two groups of employees here. The ones that are already working for you, that you will not be expected to go back through their files and check that they've applied for pre or full settled status. You may wish to communicate with them and encourage them to, as Bev put really well. Some employers are insisting on seeing that people have applied because of the risk to individuals, but that carries risks of claims being brought against the employer because they've got no legal basis to ask for the information. For new employees, again, for the first 6 months of this year, you are only required to see the passport to ensure that they're European, and that will give you the statutory excuse against illegal working. But you may wish to take steps to ensure that people understand, even if it's just a conversation, so that they understand that if they qualify for it, they must apply for it. It's really straightforward, and the deadline is the end of June, because I can't stress enough how unpleasant it could be for people if they're criminalised overnight and find it harder to rent a flat, get a new job, open a bank account, access some healthcare and so on. It's pretty big.
And Bev, what do you see your responsibility as an employer in how much do you feel is on the individual?
I think where it gets kind of really interesting is what happens on the 1st of July, because yeah, we'll have had that statutory excuse of we've asked for the right things at the time of employment and recruitment, but from an ethical audit perspective and doing the right thing, we morally want to make sure that we're employing people that are legally allowed to be here. So that's where it will get really tricky in my view, and I'm not quite sure what the what we'd need to do at that stage.
And that risk would manifest itself if let's say it's Gerwyn and he pops into your office on the 5th of July and says, "Hi Beth, I just realised I was supposed to apply for something and I haven't." It's at that point that you will find out that he is in the UK illegally. And don't do this without taking advice, but you may need to end employment and even report him to the Home Office. So that's where it could become real. The more that you can do to impress on people the importance of it, the better, really.
Yeah, as well as the GLAA may well be on the lookout for that too.
Yeah.
There's a,
we had a few questions about the care sector specifically, and Gerwyn, I might put this one to you on kind of skilled, so nurses being skilled, care workers being unskilled. Any advice for people within that care sector that are really relying on EU workers to deliver? And obviously it's been a particularly tough time for that sector over the last few months.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not to say that care workers have been excluded. It ultimately depends on the level of seniority. So if the occupation is at RQF level 3 or above, then they will be eligible. And the Home Office has its own website which shows which occupations are eligible. I think it's called skilled worker visa eligible occupations and something, which I should add the government are working through in terms of improving its functionality to make it a lot more accessible, so people can just go in and type, what's called a SOC code, which so the ONS produce SOC codes for each individual occupation, and you match that against the eligibility criteria.
Thank you. And Bev, maybe you could just give a little bit more insight on how you went about lobbying government. What kind of tips could you give people on if they feel they need to see more change in the sector?
So any call for evidence we've responded to, and we followed that up with letters to our local MPs in wherever we've got a site. So lots of letters to MPs and letters to the Secretary of State of both, well, so the Home Secretary and the Secretary of State of DEFRA. Thank
you. Sorry, I've just lost what I was going to ask next. There's so many questions going on. Ian, just one more for you. Can you clarify how minimum salaries work for pre-settled status? Because we have quite a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, and there is minimum salary rules do not apply to people with pre-settled status or settled status. You can pay them as you would anyway. Obviously, make sure that you're compliant with national minimum wage and the like, but the immigration rules do not say that people with those statuses need to be paid a particular amount.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring it to a close there because we have run out of time. We'll talk offline about how we get this information to you, because there's so many questions there. I'm sure we can work up some written content that answers some of those, and we can share it with everybody who watched the webinar, but also far beyond. Thank you so much for taking part, Bev, Gerwyn and Ian, and for laying out the information, very complex information, but in an accessible way that hopefully people found useful. Thank you everybody for your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to them, but like I said, we'll find a way to how the CIPD can offer a little bit more insight on this, and we've got lots of resources on our Brexit hub, so please do kind of go there as a first point of call, and hopefully that will answer some of your questions. And I think that is it from us. Reminder of our benefits on the screen there, the employment law helpline. If you do want some kind of to run anything past an employment lawyer, that's free for members, so do remember that you can access that. So thank you very much again to our panel, thanks to our audience, and we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon and good luck getting your head around all of this. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.